morning. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's lovely to see so many new faces at our campus for this wonderful event that we are hosting this morning. My name is Ronel Blom. I'm the Dean of Research, and I'll be chairing the session this morning. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker this morning, Professor Marius Herholdt. And I must be honest, I don't know whether you looked at the abstract, but I had to go and look up quite a few words, okay, in order to and make sure that I know how to pronounce them so that I can read the abstract to you. But I think he is a bit more relaxed in his conversation with us than in his writing. Anyway, so Professor Marius Herholdt has a master's cum laude in sociology, a DPhil in philosophy, and an M theology and systemic theology. And his topic is wellness. And wellness, he says, is, as affirmed by the World Health Organization policies, the new health. The paradigmatic core of wellness is as a systems approach aligned to salutogenic practice. Now that means, apparently, there is a factor supporting human health and well-being rather than focusing on disease, which is, I think, a really interesting view of looking at health. So this constitutes a venture beyond the biomedical model to work with a human organism from the vantage point of organismic integration, i.e. a complex structure of interdependent and subordinate elements whose relations and properties are largely determined by their function in the whole. The origin of the wellness movement is principally rooted in the humanistic psychology, positive psychology, clinical sociology, and I believe there are some clinical psychologists among us today as well, so welcome, and transpersonal spirituality. It aspires to overcome the dichotomy of a dualistic worldview, reductionist ontology, and positivistic epistemology underlying orthodox healthcare, failing largely to address the pathological challenges of escalating psychological dysfunction and chronic diseases in the 21st century. How's my reading so far? The current academic challenge is to formulate a model consistent with the day-to-day practices of wellness to serve as a theoretical framework for wellness as a narrative for total health care. A successful model may assist practitioners to better understand their task to enhance total well-being, provide focused and informed leadership, and manage wellness outlets more effectively. So, in very highfalutin academic words, I'm sure that it will all be explained. I'm not minimizing it. I'm not making any fun of it. It's just the difficulty to read all of these difficult words in front of an important audience. But with those few words and with the reading of the abstract, I would like you with me to welcome Professor Herholdt. We are in your hands.
Thanks, Ronel. Thank you, Dr. Blom, and thank you for all the officials of the Vinci being here. Mario, good to see you as well. And I've been involved with the Vinci now for the past 10 years, and it has been an enriching experience because of the fact that the Vinci makes provision for interdisciplinary training, although the focus is on management. So we also serve as a research associate for wellness at the Vinci. Thank you, Ronel, for the invitation to speak to you about this exciting topic. Wellness excites me because I think, I always say to my students that the wonderful thing about our occupation is that any person with a body is a potential client because we're all in need of wellness. So my purpose today is then to say that there is a narrative that wellness is the new health. And our task as academics is to formulate a model to operationalize the concept of wellness, to formulate a model to make it academically viable and valid. And so where does the concept of wellness derive from? And I'm so glad to see many of my colleagues and students here. I'm not sure whether they're here to support me or to check me up, but nevertheless, I'm glad that you're here. So, many years ago already, the Alma-Ata and Jakarta conferences of the World Health Organizations declared that we should reformulate health to regard it not as the absence of disease, but as a positive state of mental, emotional, social, physical well-being. So automatically that places the concept of wellness within an holistic or systems understanding. But the challenge is now how to bring all these different facets of human existence together. So during the 1960s, a medical doctor by the name of Albert Dunn proposed that we should see health on a continuum where the one pole represents low-level wellness and the other pole represents high-level wellness. And as he says, we are all in that river, either on the low or the high side. Obviously, those people who are at the high-level wellness will experience health, because health, in a sense, then becomes a symptom of high-level wellness. And low-level wellness will result, obviously, in disease oftentimes. So the challenge is that if this is true, that people who are at a low-level wellness, which means it's not their health, but their total existence, their emotional and social and even spiritual aspects that are being compromised, if that then leads to disease, what is the sense of treating or even diagnosing disease unless you at the same time become able to shift people to the pole of more high-level wellness? And Dunn's motivation was, as a medical doctor, even in those days, to come to the realization that there were so many escalating chronic diseases that was not the system that was not being addressed by the medical fraternity at that time. So obviously there were lifestyle diseases that were not addressed by just prescribing pills. And so I recently listened to Dr. Aaron Motsoaledi, the current Minister of Health, who said on TV the other day that he says, I've been in healthcare now for 35 years and I've never seen so many diabetics and cancer patients and so on. So, you know, it's rampant, it's escalating, and pills are not the answer. So our only recourse then is to say we must follow and find a more comprehensive approach to help people to improve their health by improving their general wellness. So there is a photo of Albert Dunn, who says the problem which face medical as well as public health professionals have changed character drastically in the last few decades. Chronic illness and mental disease are far more prevalent. So how do we address that? And his proposal was that we should institute well-being as a more comprehensive approach. This idea of wellness was already coined by the developmental psychologists. As we all know, Abraham Maslow was the father of the hierarchy of needs. And at the apex of this hierarchy, he placed human beings as self-actualizing human beings. So as part of healing and development, we're all on our way to a high level of wellness. And so there's a need for a positive approach, because most doctors and psychologists today are experts of pathology. They diagnose by looking at the criteria and then say, okay, fine, you're a diabetic or you're this or that. But who are the experts on health? So this is I think, a paradigmatic change that is needed where we train people to be experts in health without them focusing on disease to improve well-being, and in doing so to overcome disease and sickness. Sorry. So the moment we become aware of a need or a challenge such as that of wellness, which is a more comprehensive approach, then we are faced with a challenge to change our concepts of space and time, in the words of Fritjof Capra, which says the concepts of space and time are so basic for the description of natural phenomena that their modification entails a modification of the whole framework that we use to describe nature. So this is quite a drastic shift to make then. And so there are many efforts to make this shift, like for instance that of medical sociologist Aaron Antonovsky, who said that we should break away from the dichotomy of body and soul, which we've still inherited from Plato, and then it was formalized by Descartes, the French philosopher, who made the distinction between mind and body. But the problem was that if you make mind ontologically different from the ontology of body, then you're sitting with a split in which, as Francis Schaeffer would say, the one would always eat up the other one. So that also is what led to the process of secularization that we sit with today. That on the one side we have that which is holy, that which belongs to the church, and on the other hand that which is profane, which is secular. And never the twain shall meet. People's Sunday life and Monday life are two separate worlds, because mind or spirit on the one hand, or heaven on the one hand, and world on the other hand, are two different categories. So in holism or systems thinking, there is an effort to reconcile the two, to bring them into integration, to say they are just different manifestations of one underlying reality. And that is an important point, because as we shall see, a systems approach then is what underlies the understanding of well-being. And I like Arthur Stanley's definition that the new medicine views optimal health as much more than the absence of disease. Health is seen as a state of well-being in which the individual's body, mind, emotions, and spirits are in harmony with and guided by an awareness of society, nature, and the universe. So, if we look carefully at this definition, we see that we are here regarding the individual's body within a larger system, that of society, within another system, that of the world or the ecological system or the cosmos or whatever. So there is a plea for continuity. So Barbra Montgomery, Dossie says, with holism we consider the integrated whole to understand the person or situation. We view everything in terms of patterns and processes that combine to form a whole instead of seeing things at fragments, pieces, or parts. So if this is true, then there's an ethical injunction that we cannot really afford to zoom in only on the body or only on the mind without giving due consideration to the total person. But that in itself is problematic, because how do you do that? Because if you go to a public university, you study within a department, within a faculty, and you enroll for a specific course. And if you study psychology to work with the mental part, you're not allowed to transgress the boundaries to go into the physical part or even the spiritual part, because you're not a doctor and you're not a theologian. And we've seen that exactly happen when recently Tim Noakes became famous for being taken to court by the dietitians who says he's transgressing his scope of practice. He's a doctor, and irrespective of the fact that Tim Noakes published many articles on nutritional research, they still regarded him as somebody that has no authority to say anything about diet, and the fact that in his experience most people were carbohydrate or insulin resistant. In the end, he won the court case and he published the book, The Law of Nutrition, and I think that is a good change. But the thing is that a public university has become a multiversity. It's no longer a university because you don't have the coherence of all knowledge coming together. People are becoming specialists in more and more narrow sectors, and they fail to see the bigger picture, because this is what wellness is actually saying, challenging us to do, is to see the bigger picture. And so I find that if we now use this heuristic, it can be very helpful for us to determine the methodological position of all disciplines. Let's test it. If we take this heuristic and we put the line of ontology, in other words, referring to that which exists, the way it exists, obviously the ontology of a chair is different from that of a dream because the one is tangible, the other one not. So we put it on that line, on that axis, and on this axis we put the epistemological line. Then we know that in terms of our theory of understanding, there's a subjective part and then there's an objective part. And in terms of ontology, there's an ideological part and there's also a physical part. We may also call that the transcendent and this the immanent, or we may call this the material or contextual, and we may call that the mental or the spiritual. Irrespective of what you call it, those represent opposite poles of reality. And these represent opposite poles of our understanding, our epistemology. And so, it happens so that we are often forced to assume a position in one of these quadrants to practice our discipline. Let us take, for instance, theology. Where would you place theology? Obviously, if theology works with the spiritual world and heaven and God and so on, it will be placed on the upper quadrant. If it's more an existentialist approach, it will be in this quadrant between subjective and transcendent or ideational. If it's a more contextual approach, it will be placed somewhere here. So you can go and test and you can put every discipline somewhere in one of these quadrants. If you take, for instance, within the ambit of what the Vinci is offering, leadership, I think, Mario, one could place leadership up there because leadership is about values and inspiration, all these things. Whereas management, which is a more practical administrative part, will be down here. But now, is that okay? I contend that it is not okay. Why? Because these poles recede indefinitely. If you think just about the ideational, where does it end? If you talk about transcendence, you're on your way to heaven. Many people in church are on their way to heaven, and so they lose contact with reality. Other people, again, are so materialistically inclined that there's no sense of spirituality. As a matter of fact, most science is in this quadrant because they stand for empirical observation, in other words, that which is objectively accessible. And we call that a positivistic epistemological stance because they say, well, let me explain it to you this way. I was at a recent meeting where they've introduced this new National Health Insurance Act, and there was a representative of the Department of Education, and he was explaining to us that the system is not working because there's a stock out of medicines and they have a lack of people working in the field and so on. So I dare to get up and say, sir, but tell the minister if they have a stock out of medicines, they can use herbal medicines. And immediately, behind me was sitting the chairman of the Diabetic Association, a medical doctor, and next to me the chairman of the Cancer Association, and they both jumped up and said, sir, no, we need evidence-based medicine. So that is typical a positivistic stance. A lot of herbal remedies are based on anecdotal evidence, but it's in the long run just as valid because we've been using those remedies for thousands of years. And so you see, this is the thing that many people say things and do things without considering the philosophical presuppositions on which they built. So it's sad to say, but science, in terms of its positivistic epistemology and its materialistic slant, is really training people to become agnostics. There's really not much spiritual. But that is fortunately changing, because if you read during the 60s when these quantum physicists like Werner Heisenberg and Pauli and Dirac and these people started discovering the quantum world of subatomic particles, they suddenly realized that, hey, matter is a myth, because it's actually just energy information. And to express it poetically, Gary Zukav says it so nicely. He says, the subatomic particle is the dance without the dancer. Just think about it. That's beautiful, because let's just take that and test it on our heuristic for a moment. Here is the particle. Is it there? Yeah, because it is a building block of matter. It's comprised of molecules, of atoms, so it is there. It is materialistic. But at the same time, it is information and process in such an abstract way that it becomes the dance without the dancer. So it's actually bringing this pole and that pole in a sense together in terms of our new understanding of what matter is all about. And that's why a physicist like Paul Davies wrote a book by the title of The Matter Myth. So we're starting off with a narrative without going too deep into it. What is a narrative? It is simply my story. We story. How do we story? We story in terms of our experience. So in terms of wellness, we experience the unity of body and mind, because we experience that people who live with conflict and pent-up emotions have it manifested or embodied physically. So we find that asthma and even cancer and diabetes are strongly related to some psychological stages. So if you're a doctor, you also need to be a counselor, or at least refer to somebody to a counselor. But who's got testimony to that effect that you were ever referred by a doctor to a counselor, whereas your problem may be at that very deep level, maybe an emotional, even a spiritual problem, because researchers indicate that people who have meaning and purpose in life have a much better opportunity of being healed than people who do not have it. And that's got nothing to do with religion. It's just spiritually part of my transpersonal awareness being guided by the universe and all these things. Okay, so that is the narrative that we start with. And that narrative, if we condense it into one sentence, it is a narrative that says wellness is the new health. But then we know we are actually confessing our experience that it's the total person that's in need of healing and not just the body or the mind or whatever. And so it means that if we really construct a model that is congruent to this holistic understanding, we can't sit at any single pole. We need to find a central position where we can engage with all four poles at the same time. We need transdisciplinary training. That is the challenge, and that is now why I like Da Vinci. I don't know what will happen in the future, but at the moment this is, I think, what is the underlying philosophy at Da Vinci. And so I call this hermeneutical centeredness, because hermeneutical refers to the fact that we always interpret. And there's always a social dimension. We might think that we're in contact with reality, but our epistemology can never take us to the place where truth becomes a mirror image of reality, because we always present reality in terms of interpretation. That's what I mean by hermeneutical. We always interpret in terms of our paradigms, our worldviews, our presuppositions, and so on. So in terms of that, we assume a place of hermeneutical centeredness. But here is now what is exciting, because I've been asking myself the question, if we're sitting at this point over here to take all four poles into consideration, like the quantum physicists try to do and many others, then we're going beyond the mechanism of the material world. And there's a lot of evidence in scientific research nowadays to say that we should not regard matter any longer as an objective reality. For instance, to quote Cornell de Toe, he says, in opposition to a mechanistic interpretation of the world, we can understand that all matter today, not as being passive and inert, but as possessing an inner dynamism. Dynamism is closely related to structure and pattern insofar as it deploys itself according to temporal patterns, and its deployment produces spatial patterns that are the sources of new kinds of dynamism. If we apply this to the human body, then in wellness we appeal to that inner healing propensity of the human body. That dynamism, that integral wisdom, that is evidence in wound healing. If you have a wound, it will heal itself, because that demonstrates that the body has the ability to heal itself. So it's not a lump of matter. It's alive. It has wisdom. And he even applies that to anything else in terms of the new understanding. So all these things bring these poles closer together, because if matter is no longer just matter but dynamic and not inert but in a sense vibrating with possibilities, then it comes closer to the ideological or the ideational pole. So this also echoes what Jan Smuts originally coined as holism in his 1925 book Holism and Evolution, when he says there is some internality in a system due to the configuration. The system is more than the sum total of its parts. So if we apply this to the human body, then we get to the human person as somebody or something that cannot be reduced to its parts like you find in biomedical science. So I like the quantum approach because it allows for a much more integrated understanding. Like in the words of Capra, it says quantum theory thus reveals an essential interconnectedness of the universe. It shows that we cannot decompose the world into independently existing smaller units. So it makes that hermeneutical centered point of us more valid, because all the poles are converging. There's continuity. David Bohm, who is also another quantum physicist, says one is led to a new notion of unbroken wholeness, which denies the classical idea of analyzability of the world into separately independently existing parts. He says the inseparable quantum interconnectedness of the whole universe is a fundamental reality, and the relatively independently behaving parts are merely particular and contingent forms within this whole. So they are actually just illusions, because the real reality is the unity, the undivided unity. So then in conclusion, it means that these poles are merging with one another in terms of our hermeneutical centeredness. We are actually getting to a place that we ask ourselves, is the conceptual reality that we work with not curved? Is it not a sphere rather than a planar, flat plane? Because if we put it on a flat surface, then we see the transcendence runs away and the material, all these, they never get together. But to bring them into unity in terms of our holistic understanding, they converge, and we're actually curving conceptual space. But let's also ask the question, if we curve conceptual space in terms of saying we bring all the poles together of our understanding into one, hermeneutical centeredness, then perhaps there's also a possibility that they're not only curving in conceptual space to come together, but that they are also coming together in another sense, maybe in the sense of quantum space. So I use Einstein here because when Einstein postulated his theory of general relativity, and you must understand he did that against the background of Newtonian science, which viewed the celestial bodies in linear ways using Euclidean science, the attraction between the sun and the earth and so on, as straight lines that he could calculate. But Einstein said, in the face of Maxwell's theory of electromagnetic radiation, that those mechanical perspectives cannot apply once you get to try and explain electromagnetism and even gravitation. So fortunately, Einstein thought of Riemannian curvilinear geometry, which enabled him to see the universe as curved. And that is very significant because Einstein then proposed that gravitation is not the pull between two celestial bodies, but actually the curvature that is caused by the mass of, for instance, the Earth, that causes the moon to roll down that slope. But the centripetal and centrifugal forces keep them in orbit, but it's a curvature. But remember now, if we talk about the curvature, you look at this picture, you're not actually seeing three-dimensional curvature. You're only seeing curvature in two-dimensional perspective. Because to understand what curvature really means of space, we need to consider, for instance, a triangle on a flat plane. What is the sum of all the corners of a triangle? It's always 180. But if I take a little bug and I put him on this ball, and I say to the bug, draw me 3 straight lines. He will draw 3 straight lines, but in my perspective, they will not be completely straight because they're drawn on a sphere. And if that bug now has to calculate these angles, he will find that these angles are not, the sum is not equal to 180, but actually more than 180. And to go even further in mathematical sense, you will also find that the circumference is not exactly 2 pi, because it's not a straight line. It's curved. So that gives us a little bit of understanding of what it means when we talk about three-dimensional. So I want to use that again as a metaphor within the narrative context to say, then we can talk about three-dimensional instead of two-dimensional healthcare. So two-dimensional healthcare would then be the biomedical approach, a conventional approach, but three-dimensional would then be a model for wellness understanding. So in conclusion, whereas Halbert Dunn presented low and high level wellness in planar space, a flat space, as opposite poles on an x-axis, we now move into three-dimensional conceptual space, and maybe even beyond that to another space that we're not even aware of because we cannot visualize it. And so that means that we need a three-dimensional wellness model to support a growing consensus that biology must establish its own discipline in a very fundamental way, and maybe many other sciences as well. So what is the benefit of this? It would take practitioners beyond the tendency to apply reductionism and to use a novel approach in a kind of wellness space, a three-dimensional space that makes life possible and brings healing. And then to summarize, dare I say, the notion is already becoming evident in the paradigmatic shift from intellect to intuition. I'm not going to discuss this, but just as to stimulate you to think about it. We have intellect in the biomedical science, but in wellness we have intuition, because we're also working with abstract reality. From linear to non-linear, curvilinear, from how to why, from power to compassion, because in medical science you have the authority of the doctor to say, drink your medicine. But in wellness you have the compassion of entering into a helping relationship. From analysis to synthesis, that is holism. From form to process, rather, it's relational. From doing to being, that is sometimes paradoxical, because without having to do something to treat someone, people get healed. From physical to the invisible world, because we're also now engaging with the transpersonal, in the sense of the openness to meaning and awareness, reaching self-actualization. From technical to natural, least intervention, not to upset the body, and from cure, just to take care. So in closing, I want to conclude with what Dr. David Ager says, who is an oncologist, but also one that practices holistically. He says the good news is that if we start to model the body as a complex system, where cause and effect does not apply, which means controlling out without necessarily understanding every fundamental component. Wow, I mean, that is a very humble position to take, because in positivistic science you will say, I can't accept it if I don't understand it. And then there are many things that you don't understand and you chuck it out of the window. So even if we don't understand, because it's complex, people, complexity means that there are feedback loops of self-organization. So you'll never be able to fully fathom it. But yet we can work with it, and then we may able actually to get somewhere, because ultimately in wellness the body will also heal itself once we trigger that self-healing ability. And that is what makes me excited about wellness. Thank you very much.
That was absolutely amazing, and I have so many questions. So my first question is that, and you made the comment, is that this is a school of management, school of business management, and yet you feel attracted to what we do here. And I mean, I understand why, I think, but my first question then is, how do you recontextualize or use this kind of conceptual frame in a modern workplace? What does it mean for an HR practitioner in a modern workplace? What does it mean for a manager, for a CEO in a modern workplace? How does that apply?
I think that in the corporate world, more and more human resources managers are becoming aware of the fact that the people they're working with are not there to just render productivity and as a workforce, but they are people with feelings and attitudes and persons that need to take responsibility and be motivated and take ownership and so on. So I think by bringing that in can, in a sense, enhance the productivity of any business, and it can also help people to see that working is not only for earning money, but it's part of my self-expression, it's part of my growth, of my development. And in a wellness context, as I've explained, this is part, even if we look at sickness or infirmity, we see that as a challenge that helps one to go beyond, because to approach self-actualization means that you go beyond your problems. You conquer your problems. You don't sidestep your problems. You go beyond your needs to be in a place where you feel you have the confidence and the self-fulfillment. And not many people, I think, reach that goal. Martin Heidegger says that he's never met anybody younger than 50 who has reached a place where they can say, I find self-fulfillment. So I really think the wellness concept, being a holistic concept, is really applicable in all situations. It's not a separate category just for health practitioners. It's really something that we can integrate also in management and in I think, leadership. Yeah.
Okay. Based on that, yes, there's a question.
So the question, if I can just add on to what Professor was saying, there's been a significant shift in industry at the moment from employee assistance programs to employee wellness programs.
Yes.
And that is extremely significant because now they are taking wellness into the context of the workplace. And they are integrating it into the well-being of people. So people are now becoming more informed and relevant contextually.
Okay, thank you. I hear that, but I want to put out a challenge here. And maybe the challenge is a little bit unfair because I'm now asking the practitioners to comment on it. But as an employee in an organization, think of yourself as an employee wherever you work, all right? Do you experience that kind of awareness of the holistic person in your employment? How many would say they do? Yes? How many say they don't? Yeah. I think that's the thing. That's what I'm asking.
I think it's because, once again, the work situation is often divorced from real life situation. You go to work, you don't talk about your problems tonight, you see your wife. It's two separate things, and I think that if we look at wellness as a comprehensive concept, we view it as a house with many rooms. The one room is physical wellness, the other room is mental, the other one is your work, or financial wellness, even governmental or political peace and all these things. But they are entangled in the sense that the one will always influence the other one. So you cannot be well in one aspect and not include the others. Yes. You can't really say, I'm successful, I earn a lot of money, but I'm on the brink of getting divorced. Yeah. So that is the integration that is needed in wellness, to be able to link all these aspects in a whole of existence. Yeah.
I'd like to comment from a practical side, being in practice for about 30 years. I think there's a huge difference in the younger persons coming to my practice. They come with different questions to help or to be counseled to well-being, and the older people treat my illness. So it's definitely a different way of thinking. The shaping is different, and maybe where we, in the context of tips at the Vinci, the openness for our clients, then to go to the global understanding of how the shift was already done. And I think it's important when you, either in business or in teaching or in caring, that we understand that holism is the only way that people will catch on to maybe a different resonance.
I think the key word you've mentioned, Joyce, is to unlearn, because we've all been so conditioned. We grew up in a reductionistic perspective. And if I can use one example that always offends me, is that you go to hospital and you become a patient. And you diagnose, you hear people say, I'm a diabetic. So they become their disease. They can't transcend their disease and say, I'm a human person, whatever that means, created in God's image, or however you want to formulate it. And then your family members are only allowed to visit you during visitation hours. And you need the support of your people. I've seen at Little Company of Mary now, they've opened it up to the family members. In China, they bring in the family members to come and feed the patient, because that's part of the healing process. Otherwise, you reduce to your vital statistics, and that doctor never knows anything about you. Doesn't see you as a human person. And I think the same thing happens in a corporate market. They know you as the one doing the job, and nothing beyond that. And that is what is so sad. So, in a sense, wellness is a way to heal this fragmentation that took place in society. And really, I think the climax of that fragmentation is secularization. We've divided the world into so many parts. Yeah.
So, the way I interpreted it when you spoke about it earlier is that the workplace owns the mind or the body, depending on the work you do, but not both. And I think that is as a result of an industrialized society where everything is incredibly linear, incredibly process driven. Step 1, step 2, step 3, and so on. I don't know if you want to comment on that.
I once was invited to present a lecture at Sasol, and I talked about the idea of complexity in the workplace, which is popularly known as chaos theory to express non-linearity. And I challenged the CEO and I said, why don't you allow people to, instead of providing them with a job description, allow them to determine their own ambit of work in terms of their aptitude and their potential. And he was quite excited about the idea. Now to implement it, I know, is another story. But just to demonstrate the idea that instead of regulating in an authoritative way, to say to people, because biomedical science is a top-down approach. Wellness is a bottom-up approach, and that is the difference.
I just want to piggyback on your question that you asked about employees and what you were saying too. I come from the corporate world. I left it about 5 years ago. But I've now been asked by a very large company to be a service provider to do counseling for their staff. And I consistently find that the employees battle. Because it's the leadership doesn't believe that they need it.
That's what
so now they get better, but the leadership doesn't get better. So I found that I don't think I'm going to get any more business because I find that the people are leaving because they get better and they see that they're in a toxic environment and they need to get out of it. So it's not just from one division because they would refer several people and it's consistently the same. So there's something happening in the leadership. But when you ask for a meeting so that you can give feedback, we'll let you know. It's never convenient, type of thing. So I hear that. But it's pushing up, but they're being stopped.
That's my sense of that it's being paid lip service. It's paid lip service, we have to do it. It's the politically correct thing to do, but it's not something that we're really convinced that that is needed.
And we can say that we're doing this for our staff.
Yes.
But that's the staff getting better, but they don't get
Exactly.
But you see, once again, let me just say what's interesting is that I remember about 2 or 3 years ago, I was external examiner for one of the Vinci candidates whose topic for his PhD thesis was the spiritual qualities of a leader. And it was about 80% theology and 20% management. And I was very impressed because I thought that was very much needed. But if you would present that kind of topic to a public university, they would say, this is not a theology department. You see, so that's once again is where we fragment and snipper up.
To what degree do you think the reductionism that you spoke about, the compartmentalization of the different aspects of medicine and business draws from or is a result of basic education? You go to school, you're told this is maths class, this is English class, this is arts class, and even though there are aspects of geography that in the real world complement aspects of art and vice versa, from day one of school they're taught completely separately. To what degree do you think this lack of holism in this context and in other contexts as a result of that? That's essentially the question. Do you think it's the positivist epistemology and the reductionism is built into us from day one?
Definitely, science is built on positivism, and fortunately, I think the understanding of quantum physics is challenging all of that, but it's still very prevalent. And I remember that about 10 years after I've left school, I was busy building my own house on a piece of land, and I sat with a plan, and I was challenged now to mark out my room and it has to be 90 degrees. And I thought to myself, how am I going to do that? Then I remembered, mathematics, the formulation of Pythagoras. So that enabled me to do it. But I could never bring mathematics to real life because it's just an academic discipline. So we are so conditioned, it's very difficult, especially for academic people, to make this shift. And in a Kuhnian sense, a paradigm shift is only possible if within a certain framework, there are so many anomalies that you cannot solve, that it forces you into a crisis. And then you may have to make, like Einstein, he was forced to move from Euclidean geometry to Riemannian geometry to meet the evidence of what was facing him. So without that crisis, you cannot just press a button and make that shift. It's not possible.
The paradigm shift that you're talking about, in order to achieve a paradigm shift such as this, what would a practical way be to go about it? Do you think that it's how medicine should be taught, or do you think it should be a change the education system in general? So would approaches such as Montessori or Waldorf at a basic education level result in this sort of paradigm shift, do you think?
It can't be changed on an institutional level because it's entrenched in society. It can only be changed by people who start believing and practicing the new paradigm, like the wellness counselors. And I think that is pivotal to such a change. And it's taking place. I can tell you, for instance, in medical science, you nowadays find schools of what they call integrative medicines, which is a way of reconciling mental and physical health, and even functional physiology and psychophysiology and so on. So it is taking place on ground level, but not in the academic circles, unfortunately.
Which is perhaps where it should start, as you said, from the
bottom up. From the bottom up, yeah.
Previous points of my colleagues linked up with this. I find that the reality in South Africa is, to bring these concepts, they don't exist in the world. Even the employee assistance programs, people are scared to use them.
Yes.
The next retrenchment comes along, these guys get retrenched. They're scared to, unless it's issues such as TB, HIV, where they can actually get tablets and things at the clinics, which just facilitates that, they will use it. But to use it for things such as depression, anxiety, PTSD, post-traumatic syndrome things, they don't use it because they are scared. They are scared that it will affect their work. And a lot of people are using it as performance management tools, which is unfair. And the other reality is that, we're sitting with, and I know this is unofficial, but we're sitting with the unofficial unemployment rate of 42%. It's not 42%, it's actually 42%. And a lot of people are in the informal markets. And that informal market is just getting bigger and bigger and bigger because of our economy.
Yes.
So, to actually bring it into a country like South Africa or Africa as a whole is very, very difficult. We've got cultural obstacles, very different to, for instance, what India has. India's already entrenching, their culture has entrenched a lot of this, the spiritual side. China, Far East, and so on. But we really, I'm maybe very cynical, but I believe in all these concepts, but how do you really bring it to a country like South Africa?
But I think one good thing that you've mentioned is the African perspective, because the African perspective is an holistic perspective. And in many universities, they're now bringing in indigenous knowledge systems because they find it the black people find it very difficult to work within the framework of Western science. And I think the postmodern world there's a trend towards more the African or the Eastern Oriental concepts. And that maybe is a good thing, because if we allow that influence to cipher through, then maybe it can be helpful to change our minds.
One thing that I pick up from the conversation that concerns me a little bit is when we talk about the corporate environment as something out there, it's not, we're part of it.
Yes.
We are part of society. I've got a private practice where I work for one of the huge corporate companies for the past 18 years, where I'm part of the wellness program, where I'm part of the crisis management, the trauma management, and if they know they're going to put somebody through disciplinary processes because of complex stuff, they get me in to do the counseling. But we need to come from a place of facilitation where we communicate with them, not as though we know everything, where we also acknowledge and respect them for the professions they are in, and we add to that. Really, if we work for a company for 18 years on a contract basis on an ad hoc contract basis, we must be doing something right.
I'm more around the HR business. I'm the business where I have to get people to perform in terms of sales. And it's been quite interesting with more than one corporate company being a practical implementation. It's not as simple to get a group of people together because they may find some of your ideas ridiculous. It's far beyond what they can conceptualize and their own frame of reference. But if you start with a person, on a person-to-person level, and you start with spiritual healing, okay, then you start to find you have the basis to build on the rest, and then they start accepting everything else that you say. And then their performance changes. And people are amazed, they don't know, what did you do? But that's the whole concept of changing it, maybe not in masses, it's with that one person at a time. And then they start calling for the next person, I know this guy's got a problem, can you help me? So you've got to gain people's trust if you want to move their paradigms.
And that's very emotive.
Yeah,
Trust.
it's emotive, yeah.
It's value driven, isn't it? That's very interesting. So my final question, I always get to be, when I'm the chair, I always get to have the final question. So my final question is, what crisis do we need?
Well, I think we're already in a crisis. I think many people are being confronted by the fact that the old system is redundant. And to get back to that earlier question, how do we change it? The good thing is that I find that many people are intuitively tuning into this understanding. But the lack is to being able to conceptualize it. This is why, to me, it's so important to establish a model as a guideline to make people get into this framework and give an account at least. So that is a good thing. The crisis is there. And the crisis is part of the shift in modern world that is taking place, and the challenge, as I've mentioned, of escalating diseases and infirmities and all these things, and the fact that most people are despondent and many people have depression and so on. Why? It is synonymous with wellness to talk about abundant life or the good life. So this is what we aspire for. That doesn't mean that it will rule out suffering or hardship, but it means that in total we'll be well, irrespective of these things. Antonov's idea of a sense of coherence. If we find intelligibility, somebody mentioned spirituality. We're also afraid to talk about spirituality because people always think you're talking about religion. But if we talk about spirituality not as a top-down revelation in a theological sense, but as a bottom-up approach, as I've mentioned, of awareness of whatever, Viktor Frankl's approach of finding meaning and purpose, I think then that already is taking us away from materialism to an awareness and of openness that this world is not the only world that we see. There's more. And we don't identify only with the personal self, but also with the cosmic self, or the universal self, or the ecological self, to take us beyond this narrow confines of where we're living at the moment. And that, I think, is what is not only the academic value of wellness, but also the existential wellness to bring us into this abundant life that we're all aspiring as human beings to, that we're meant for.
Yes.
Yes.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Oh, there is a question.
Just maybe something. To what extent are some of our legislative acts actually glamorizing the opposite side of wellness, or the downside of wellness. I'm thinking of the push within big corporate organizations, etc., for people to declare. And it's almost like fashionable to declare things like I'm stressed, or I suffer from bipolar, or this, that, and the other. And I'm not too sure if we're actually not encouraging people to want to own certain illnesses, because you did say people say I'm diabetic, it's something to be proud of. Yeah.
That's a very important point, because in the end, you know, somebody asked me the other day, what is wellness? And I said, I don't know. You see, but you're supposed to know, you know, because you're the president of the Association for Wellness Practitioners. But I'm saying I don't know in the sense not that I don't have an idea, but that I don't want to create the impression that this is the only thing that wellness can be.
This is the definition.
Yeah, this is the definition, because for each person, wellness will be different. And I hear what you're saying. There's a real risk, I think, of idolizing the state of wellness as becoming a superhuman being and being immune to hardship and disease or whatever. That's not what wellness is. It's more than just mind over matter or becoming a superhuman being. It's actually just becoming what you're supposed to be and to see the bigger picture where you fit in. So we need a model to, I think, guide us and inspire us, but we must refrain from thinking we know what wellness is.
So it's the absence of fear and pain. It's not the absence of fear and pain.
No, it's not the absence.
It's acknowledging it's there, but that's not the only thing that's there.
But not to see it as a threat, but as a challenge.
Yes.
That can be overcome.
Yeah.
That, I think, is the push of wellness.
Yeah.
To go beyond that and to conquer. It's actually defining human existence, in a sense. Saying what the quality of life is all about. Because oftentimes people also ask me, if you talk about wellness, does it mean longevity? I think the eldest person in the world at the moment is 137. But it's not about that. It's about the quality of life. So longevity is the bonus. It's a bonus, but it's not about anything else, but just becoming what you're supposed to be, fulfilling your potential, and using all that is at your disposal to realize that I exist on different levels. So in order for me to be well, I need input and support from the biochemical, from the spiritual, from the mental, from the emotional, from the social. It's all about relationships, all these things coming together. And that's actually the root meaning of the word holiness, then to go to religion. Because holiness comes from the root to be whole, to be complete. I came to give you life and life abundantly. That is, I think, the bottom line.
Yeah, beautiful. Nothing more to be said. Wonderful. Thank you very much.